The citizens of the United States cherish sentiments most friendly in favor of the liberty and happiness of their fellow men on the other side of the Atlantic. In the wars of the European powers and matters relating to themselves, we have never taken any part, nor does it comport with our policy to do so. It is only when our rights are invaded or seriously menaced that we resent injuries or make preparation for our defense. With the movements in this hemisphere, we are of necessity more immediately connected, and by causes which must be obvious to all enlightened and impartial observers. The political system of the Allied powers of Europe is essentially different in this respect from that of America. This difference proceeds from that which exists in their respective governments, and to the defense of our own, which has been achieved by the loss of so much blood and treasure, and matured by the wisdom of their most enlightened citizens, and under which we have enjoyed unexampled felicity, this whole nation is devoted. We owe it therefore to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers of Europe to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. Any interposition on their part for the purpose of oppressing the American republics or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power can only be regarded in the light of a manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States. That is from President James Monroe, his 7th annual message to the Congress of the United States on December 2nd, 1823, declaring the Monroe Doctrine, whose bicentennial we now celebrate. I'm Joshua Treviño, and this is The Hard Country.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hard Country podcast. My name is Melissa Ford, and I'm a policy director at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and I am joined by Joshua Treviño, the foundation's Chief of Intelligence and Research. Josh, I think you just broke a record for the shortest passage you've ever read, but thank you for reading it.
Trying to improve.
So you chose a passage about the Monroe Doctrine, and we are coming up, well, actually, we just celebrated the 200th anniversary, I think, on December 2nd.
Yes. Some celebrated, some merely marked.
Yeah, some not so much, but it is the anniversary of when it was first articulated in 1823.
Correct.
By James Monroe. So can you tell us a little bit about why you chose that passage for today's episode?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you, Melissa. You know, the Monroe Doctrine has sort of been relegated to the dustbin of history, particularly in the past 30 years. It was last current in U.S. political discourse really in the 1980s when there was significant questions about the movement of international communism onto the American mainland in places like Nicaragua, for example. But since then, it's fallen by the wayside. I say it's been forgotten in the United States. It has not been forgotten in Latin America by any stretch. Where I would say, correct me if this is not your experience growing up in Bolivia, but when you hear the Monroe Doctrine invoked in Mexico, for example, or in Central America, I've worked in Nicaragua, and you can hear a lot of Monroe Doctrine talk there. It's always in the context of this very malign and oppressive U.S. tendency to intervene in the lives of these American republics, and so I think it's fair to say it's regarded as mostly a negative. Do you disagree with that? Did you hear about that growing up? By the way,
No.
I mean, the United States has never intervened in Bolivia, really.
I think most Bolivians have never heard of it, but
Okay.
I do agree that a lot of people in Latin America that hear from it think it's like the U.S.'s inability to mind their own business.
Sure, exactly. So I want to make an argument here on the show that is going to forever disqualify me from working at the United States State Department, which is fine. I want to argue. It will also make me unpopular if I'm not already with great swaths of Latin American political society. I want to argue that the Monroe Doctrine is a positive good and is a positive good for Latin America too. And let me explain what I mean by that. In every order of nations, it's going to be a hegemon of some sort. So the question really is not whether there's going to be a hegemonic order, particularly in like a Westphalian system and a pre 1945 order of nations. Although there's hegemonic powers after that, but the question is who is it going to be? When the Latin American republics in aggregate separate from the Spanish Empire in really kind of this extended period in the decade of the 1810s and 1820s, And then the full independence of Brazil comes roughly contemporaneous with that, a little bit after. Brazil becomes fully independent, like the branch of the Portuguese real house relocates to Rio de Janeiro. I've forgotten the year. At which it happened. But anyway, so all these republics come into being, and they're weak. I think the Brazilian state probably had the most resilience, but there's not a lot of internal cohesion. There's a lot of working out of what borders are and what polities are and so on that basically extends for, well, it's still underway now in some ways. And so there was a real sense that these republics weren't going to last, that they too were Republican, small R Republican experiments, much like the United States, and that eventually there would be a European power that would step in and take them over. And you actually saw this happen on more than one occasion. You saw. I think it was the what's now the Dominican Republic actually reverts to Spanish rule at one point, which is crazy to say, but it does. Resubjects itself to that. Both the Spanish and the French make efforts to take over Mexico. The Spanish are thwarted by the efforts of the Mexicans themselves. The French, I would argue, were thwarted because the United States enforced the Monroe Doctrine. And so what keeps in kind of this framework in which there's this chronic weakness. I don't want to overstate it too much. Chile, for example, was a very cohesive polity in the 19th century. Argentina as well. But you can't really say that about any republic between the Darien Gap and the Rio Grande. Unfortunately, it's just a reality. And so the question is who's going to be there to control it. My argument is that had the United States not declared the Monroe Doctrine, exactly 200 years ago, and then found the means in the second half of the 19th century to really enforce it, to start bringing, its will and its imposition to it, that there's a real possibility that Latin America, including South America, would have ended up with something like the fate of maybe not Africa, but certainly a lot of East Asia, partitioned out into spheres of influence, possessions of great powers, and so on. And the fact that didn't happen, it didn't happen to the same extent that it did anywhere else, particularly in the great age of colonization, is because the United States took the far-sighted decision to assert itself in this way. I'll close with this, not to filibuster all the way, but I'm an enthusiast for the Monroe Doctrine. Obviously, when you look at the United States strategic position, this gets ignored quite a bit. Essentially, between 1815, so you have the Treaty of Ghent, the close of the War of 1812, and then essentially 1848, which is the close of the Mexican War. So you have this period of basically a generation, really a 30 to 35-year period, in which at the opening of the 35-year period, the United States actually is in serious strategic peril on every front. On the high seas, they're inferior to the Royal Navy, not qualitatively, but just in terms of sheer numeric power. The Spanish Empire is significant, and there's a real question as to who's going to control the western approaches to North America. The British are still in Canada, obviously, and are capable of repelling an American invasion and also setting fire to our capital. And so there's not a real sense that the United States is such, although it's large and it's prosperous, that it's strategically secure. And what's interesting about this stretch of history, and you have to give the Jacksonian's principle, though by no means sole credit for it, is that every one of those strategic issues gets solved in that 30 to 35-year period. Every one of the threats in being to the United States, whether it's from the United Kingdom or the Spanish Empire, or what becomes the Mexican possessions, all of it gets resolved. The Monroe Doctrine has to be seen in that light. It's an effort to take a strategic threat to the United States off the chessboard. And the reason that we ought to remember it is not purely historical, because we have let it go by the wayside, because we have decided and kind of indulged in this holiday from history post-Cold War and allowed strategic independence in the Western Hemisphere that frankly previously didn't exist to the degree that it does now. And so outside powers, it's less a matter of Latin American nations asserting their strategic independence, but it's outside powers are now allowed in. I mean, it's simply crazy that we've allowed Hezbollah, the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese to establish themselves in the Western Hemisphere as they have, but they have. We need to remember that it is assertions like this and doctrines like this that kept the United States safe for 200 years, and it's time for us to rediscover that, because those theaters of strategic action and threat will reassert themselves given our negligence. Thank you for listening to all that. Yes.
Thank you actually for giving that background. I think a lot of people are not familiar with the Monroe Doctrine here or a lot of people in Latin America. So thank you for that. And also I will say I think you can rest easy tonight. This won't make you one of the most hated men in Latin America. I think there's a lot of people that rank worse than you, so don't worry. Fair. So I actually think I'm glad that you were talking about the Monroe Doctrine, and since you started on that, I think that it's a good place for us to start talking about some breaking news that some people might have been seeing on TV or articles about. I know I've been having a lot of people ask me about it, and that is that it appears that Venezuela might be invading Guyana soon. And we've heard a lot of talk about this, but this is all over this piece of land. So let me back up and give it some context. For people that might not be familiar, I know some people are like, where is that? You know, a lot of people have no idea where Guyana is, and I don't blame them. You don't hear about it very often.
I want to hear your views on this, actually, because it's just so extraordinary to think of South America as a theater of war. It's because
we don't see it very often.
Right,
well, we haven't seen it in like 100 years,
right? The last one was, the Chaco War, right? And, which involved Bolivia.
Yeah.
I think, well,
it's been
a while.
Yeah.
Setting aside the Falklands, of course.
Yeah, which
is British territory.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
I think I was just telling you, I was just watching that episode of The Crown, and it's very good for those of you who haven't seen it.
It's very stirring, yes.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Please.
But basically, to back it up and give a little bit of context, the conflict is all over this piece of land.
Mm-hmm.
And this piece of land is called the Essequibo, and it's been, part of a major political battle for a very long time. So it's a territory that's made up. It's actually really beautiful. I looked it up online, a couple of pictures of it. It looks a lot like our Amazon in Bolivia, but it's made up of like rivers and waterfalls and like all these tropical forests. And apparently it's like very rich in oil and minerals and diamonds. So it's a very rich area, and it's 2/3 of Guyana, and I believe about 125,000 people live there.
So not just a piece of land, but it's 70% of the country. It's most of Guyana by territory.
Yeah, it's huge. I actually printed a map because I was like, I need to figure out what this looks like. Yeah. So if this gives you a little bit of context, this is the disputed area. So it's been part of a major political dispute, not just for decades, but for centuries.
Okay, please.
So I'm going to give you a little bit of historical context. So this goes all the way back to when Guyana was a British colony.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1899, there was what they call like an arbitral tribunal.
Mm-hmm.
I'm used to saying it in Spanish, but it's basically like this group of people that are impartial, that
it was convened by the United States, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so they like help resolve disputes in the way of arbitration. And so they awarded this area to Britain, because at the time Guyana was a British colony.
We'll have to post a map of the Essequibo and dispute it in the comments.
We can put it in
the show description. I'm sorry. Yeah,
I think you have to see it to like fully understand it. But at the time, it was basically awarded to Britain, which was the colonizing power.
Yeah.
And the Venezuelan government continued to deny that award for about 60 years, a little bit over 60 years. This was in 1899.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next thing that happened is in 1966, Britain and Venezuela reached an agreement that they would basically establish a commission. And Guyana at this point was independent. So they established a commission with Guyana representatives and Venezuelan representatives to basically like revisit the issue. But not a lot came of it. And the area is still incredibly controversial, and to this day is considered zona de reclamación. So like an area that's still in dispute.
Okay.
So that's why, and this is fascinating to me because I didn't know that before I started doing all of this research. But I called a friend, I think I told you, I called a friend yesterday that's from Venezuela. He lives in Caracas. Mm-hmm. And he was telling me that depending on who you ask, so if you were to ask someone in Venezuela, schools teach it this way. So if you were to ask like a 10-year-old kid in Venezuela to show you a map in one of their little textbooks of the area of Venezuela, it would include this portion.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but if you were to look up online, like the map of the UN, the international map of the UN, Venezuela area is much smaller and it ends at the border with Guyana. Mm-hmm. But a Venezuelan would tell you that Venezuela goes all the way from Colombia on the left, to the Essequibo River. So they still consider that area as theirs.
And Venezuela has never in its history controlled the Essequibo. Is that right? Like it was basically terra nullius. My understanding is it was terra nullius, and then the British end up purchasing what becomes Guyana from the Dutch at a certain point, 1830-ish or so. I don't remember the exact date. And then they survey it, they impose a line, and that's sort of it. But Venezuela's never had effective control. It's kind of like somewhat different circumstance, but it's kind of like the Chinese communist claim to Taiwan, which is an island that they've never controlled either. And so it's sort of...
It's kind of fascinating, the history with it. I didn't realize it went back for such a long time.
Quite a while.
Hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an area that's been in dispute for a very long time.
So why do we care now?
Yeah. Okay. So the reason that this is now an issue these days is because the Maduro government, so, we've talked about Maduro on this podcast before.
Leftist, populist, allied with China.
Yeah, not great things, but they've developed like a very strong interest recently in reclaiming that part of the territory. And I think that's because in 2015, commercial oil was discovered there.
Yes.
And with how terrible the economy is in Venezuela right now, that would be very valuable and very precious to Venezuela.
Because we should clarify, PDVSA, which is the state oil company in Venezuela, although Venezuela itself has just absolutely stupendous reserves, right?
Yeah.
But they've wrecked their infrastructure with 20 years of socialism, and so now they just need something raw to plunder. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but go ahead.
Thank you for bringing that up.
The Guyanese gave Exxon the contract.
Yeah, ExxonMobil. Yeah, exactly. And so, not a new conflict, but the more recent developments were on Sunday, there was a referendum in Venezuela which asked the people of Venezuela if they support taking action to reclaim that territory.
Yeah.
And I think there was like 5 questions, like, do you believe that we should reclaim this territory? Like a couple of different questions. And after they got the results, the Venezuelan government came out and said that 95% of people voted favorably, so they voted yes.
Do you find that, I'm just curious, and my limited understanding, I've never set foot in Venezuela, but my limited understanding is that based on a lot of what you've shared with me, pre-show, is that this is a legitimately popular issue in Venezuela. So even opponents of the Maduro regime think that the Essequibo should be theirs. Do you find that, in that light, do you find the 95% number credible, or is this just another phony Maduro referendum that we can't trust?
Well, it's hard to tell, right? Because obviously, like, the electoral system in Venezuela is not super reliable and very questionable.
Okay.
And these are numbers that are given by the government.
Like Wisconsin's. Yes, no, please.
So yeah, this is a percentage that was released by the government. So the government is telling people that it's 95%, but obviously, like, they haven't had fair and free elections in Venezuela since Maduro rose to power.
Okay.
So it's questionable on that end, but I will say, from what I've heard, this is like a very unifying issue for all of Venezuelans.
Legit popular.
So, it very well could be 95%, to be honest.
The nature of dictators is so interesting. I recall in a previous life, actually this is almost exactly 20 years ago this month, now that I think about it, December 2003, I was in Rwanda. And there was a political officer at the U.S. Embassy who was telling me about a similar phony referendum that was run by the regime in Kigali. And so they concocted a number. It was 95%ish. This is why it comes to mind. It was 95%ish. You'll have to forgive me. I've forgotten the exact subject, but they did a funny referendum, 95%. And then, having been the ones who created the figure, they then hunted down the 5% and threw him in jail, even though the whole thing was confected from the top. It's the nature of autocracy, right? Like especially when you have a paranoid autocracy, which absolutely characterizes the Venezuelan regime, that's going to leverage these things for nationalist purposes. Anyway, please, sorry, continue. It comes to mind.
Like, I need to research this a little bit more, but apparently people are being thrown in jail over that in Venezuela. I need to research.
Oh, really? Over the Essequibo?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I saw an article. I didn't have time to read all of it this morning, but I did see something along those lines.
Were they? Do you recall who it was? Were they individuals who actually opposed the claim, or were they anti-war, or what was their?
I think it's people that were standing in the way of something oil related.
Oh, of
so
course.
We'll need to, maybe I'll link something. I'll link the article that I saw for our listeners, so I don't leave you guys high and dry.
Okay.
But so anyway, we'll jump right back in, but it's unclear what all of this is going to mean. So like we were saying, like, this is a pretty unifying issue, but it doesn't seem like there will be military action from Venezuela. At least I wouldn't think so, because Guyana is being supported by the United States, by the United Kingdom, by the Caribbean, even Brazil. Like we talked a little bit about this. So it doesn't seem like it would be in their best interest. There's just too much weight from the other side on this.
Let me pose a contrary thing. If you wanted to roll the dice, the United States is stretched thin. I mean, we can't even get artillery shells to Ukraine, right? And so, all of our major deployable carrier assets are not all in the Middle East, but they're mostly oriented. So everything to put things in terms of combatant commands, everything's in CENTCOM and to a lesser extent in Indo-PACOM. Southcom, which is responsible for everything south of Mexico, doesn't have much, and there's credible arguments. I mean, who knows that the major protecting power for Guyana, it's not going to be the Guyanese because they just don't have the population to stand up to Venezuela, but it would be the Brazilians, right? And I would have to say the Brazilians. I mean, everything is notional as you tabletop war game this, so don't take this as anything more than armchair prognostication. But the Brazilians would be in a tough spot. There's an argument that they're strategically inferior, qualitatively inferior to the Venezuelans, who have been on the receiving end of a lot of Russian and Chinese and Iranian expertise, quite a bit, and the Brazilians haven't. And when you look at the transportation networks, there's I don't want to overstate this, but railheads and roads from Venezuela to Guyana exist. They're meaningful. You could drive from Caracas to what's the capital of Guyana? Georgetown, I think. So you could do that. See if it's on your map. It's not. But you could do that. I don't think you can drive from Brazil. I think there's Amazon, like Amazonian jungle in between the two, and
very thick. Yeah.
Quite. Yeah. Exactly. So it's not clear to me that the Brazilian case, and I have no insight into whether the Venezuelans would do something so foolish, but just
who knows with Maduro?
Who knows with Maduro? Let me ask you this though. I'm curious in your opinion on this. Let's say. I think we know what the instrumentalization of this is as it exists, right? Like it's good for the regime. Maduro's delivered,
especially right now, because his popularity has been falling a lot, and he thinks this is a unifying issue,
which it is.
And he has he's facing a newly unified opposition, so he thinks that this might be an easy win for him.
It could be, which is a similar situation to what the Argentinian junta looked at in 1982 when they decided to invade the Falklands. They too were kind of on the downswing. Which they ended up signing their political death warrants, as it were. Yeah. So let me ask you this. So let's say hypothetically Venezuela does this. They go and they seize the Essequibo. They get it and they stop it. They stop and there's like a sliver of 30% of Guyana that's left. What do you think? Put you on the spot a little bit. What are the follow-on effects of that? Let's say they do it and they hold it, and then set aside the United Kingdom, which is, I'm not even sure the UK armed forces can defend the UK at this point. They've just cut to the bone in so many areas. But if the United States has to basically mount a desert storm for Guyana, which who you think Ukraine's unknown to the general public. Guyana's known by almost nobody.
Absolutely.
It's mere existence. Is that a rational bet worth making for the Venezuelan regime? I mean, is that something where they say, you know what, I think we can do this because I don't think the Americans,
who would care?
Who would care? Who would do more than protest?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Because something similar is happening in Europe. There's the Ukraine stuff going on, but when I was in Poland recently, they're terrified that they're next. And that's why they're helping Ukraine. That's why they're taking their refugees. Yeah. So it's a good question. What would happen, especially with a leader right now like Maduro that's so power hungry and honestly kind of delusional in some ways, right? But it's interesting. I will say though, from what I've heard from some of my friends that I've talked to, this area that's in dispute, before Maduro, before any of that, they all were willing to fight for it. And so who can say what would happen under this crazy dictator? What would be next? I don't know.
We should draw some lines here, because typically the hard country is about Mexico and the border and things like that. But the reason we're talking about this, of course, is that this is going to spur a lot more migration, and it also ties in with themes that we've discussed many times on the show, which is that the Western Hemisphere has been neglected by American policy, and so you think kind of at a grand level. whether by deliberation or happenstance, there's a proliferation of crises, right? There's the Taiwan crisis, which is slow rolling. The Ukraine crisis erupted upon us in February 2022, which has in many ways wrecked a lot of our industrial capacity. I say wrecked. We ramped up, but we're unable to supply that war. That's one war. We used to have a 2-regional war standard in the United States, and we threw it aside about 25 years ago-ish. And so that's happened. The war in the Middle East, which no one except the bad guys expected, has come out, and that's basically drawn away a lot of our naval assets. And now there's a crisis that looks like it might erupt right here in the Western Hemisphere. Yeah. And we have to ask ourselves, what's our priority? One of the arguments I'll make, I don't want to impute views to you on this, is that even though I think going to put America on the line for Guyana is not. Who cares about Guyana? I'm not doing that to disparage the Guyanese. Have a very legitimate claim to the defense of their country. But to our earlier point, nobody really knows about it. Yeah. It's such an obscure thing. In Canada, like I didn't know, you may have, I didn't know the word Essequibo until maybe 21 days ago at most. Yeah, right. Yeah. So all of which to say, but the principle of the thing, which is that there's territorial aggression in the Western Hemisphere, there's disorder of the type that you see in the Middle East and Europe, metastasizing and coming here. One of the arguments I would make, and I think watchers of the Hard Country hopefully are well familiar with it at this point, is that of all the disorder around the world, all the threat around the world, and it's all real, the one right here at home in our hemisphere is the one we should be concerned with first, because that's the one, somebody could, people are literally doing this. I mean, it sounds crazy to say. Somebody in a war zone in Venezuela or Guyana could decide they've had enough and walk to Brownsville, Texas. People literally do this. They have to, it takes months. They go through the Darien Gap. Yeah. It's a hellish journey.
I've talked to people that have come from that far.
You have, yeah. Yes, that's exactly right. I've run into Venezuelans too. Yeah. I think we've talked about this before, like coming out of the river, and they make this journey. I mean, as bad as things are with the collapse of society throughout Latin America, the collapse of political order, to add a regional war to it would just be catastrophic on levels we've yet to see.
No, I agree, and thank you for bringing that up. That's why we're talking about it, right? Because we should care about this not just as Americans, but especially Texans should care about this. And we've made the case, I think, at least a couple of times on this podcast of why Latin America is important and why it's been ignored for so long. Not just by the United States, but especially by the conservative movement, right? Yeah. And right now, what we're seeing an international left, right, that keeps tightening their grasp on Latin America. And we should care because those are like our enemies. And Latin America is making them really, really rich and really, really powerful.
Yeah, that's right.
And so even that, we'll get back to Mexico after this, but you're seeing that a lot in Bolivia, right? Because Bolivia has the largest, and it's almost untapped, trove of battery lithium, right? Battery metal lithium in the world. Yeah. And earlier this year, no one knows about this, but earlier this year they signed a contract with China to begin to extract it. And so we're seeing that all over. China's moving in, Russia's moving in, Iran is moving in, and the United States doesn't bat an eye. So when are we going to wake up? When it's too late?
Right.
And everything that's happening down there, again, even this, like you said, it's going to lead to refugees. It's going to lead to movement. And so I think it's very important for people in Texas to be aware of it. But
Can I leverage this to kind of loop back into the Monroe Doctrine a little bit on this? Not to hopefully this is a short passage to read, but I do want to read this. So one of the interesting things with the Monroe Doctrine, which explicitly excludes extra hemispheric powers from the Western Hemisphere, is this Roosevelt corollary that comes up in 1904. So not quite a century, but about almost 81 years after the declaration of the Monroe Doctrine, you get this Roosevelt corollary from President Theodore Roosevelt. Are you familiar with this one?
No.
So a little bit less well known. So in his fourth annual message to Congress, President Theodore Roosevelt says this. Very interesting. He's talking about the Monroe Doctrine and what it's done. He says, quote, "It is not true that the United States feels any land hunger or entertains any projects as regards the other nations of the Western Hemisphere, save such as are for their welfare. All that this country desires is to see the neighboring countries stable, orderly, and prosperous. Any country whose people conduct themselves well can count upon our hearty friendship. If a nation shows that it knows how to act with reasonable efficiency and decency in social and political matters, if it keeps order and pays its obligations, it need fear no interference from the United States. Chronic wrongdoing or an impetus which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society may in America as elsewhere ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation. And in the Western Hemisphere, the adherents of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of the international police power. He closes with this passage. He says, if every country washed by the Caribbean Sea would show the progress and stable and just civilization with which the aid of the Platt Amendment Cuba has shown since our troops left the island, in which so many of the republics in both Americas are constantly and brilliantly showing, all question of interference by this nation with their affairs would be at an end. So what he's saying in this is that not only does the Monroe Doctrine obligate the United States by its nature to keep out foreign powers, but that good governance is an obligation on the part of the Latin American republics. It's a very nakedly hegemonic proclamation, and that if a Latin American republic cannot govern itself well, if it becomes a void of disorder, then the United States must step in to provide it. And so this actually characterizes the American approach for most of the rest of the 20th century, actually. The most dramatic example, the most dramatic recent example, I should say, being the U.S. invasion of Panama in 1989. But you saw it again and again. Interventions in Cuba, taking over Haiti, taking over Nicaragua, multiple interventions in Mexico, and so on. And this Roosevelt corollary is very interesting because it pops up in other contexts under different names. In the early part of this century, the 2000s, which seems odd to say, because I'm of an age. My kid the other day said that he found something from I think like the 1900s, and he was talking about something from like 1995 or something like that, which is very alarming to me. But in the early 2000s, post 9/11, there was this policy discussion about kind of ungoverned spaces, ungoverned zones, and what do you do about these ungoverned spaces and zones? And the answer, at least during the George W. Bush administration, is that you invade them. And so we've kind of, from a policy matter, we've sort of pulled back. But it keeps hitting us over and over again in various parts of the world. We're experiencing it now with Yemen, right? Like there's actually been policy discussions with the Biden team as to what you do about the Houthis in Yemen who were attacking shipping and so on. So set that aside. But just be aware that this is not just a U.S. Latin America thing. You and I have discussed, Melissa, this idea of ungoverned spaces in Mexico now. The fact that to cite former Ambassador Landau, Mexico has turned over 35 to 40% of its sovereign territory over to cartel rule. That's an ungoverned space. I mean, it's governed. It's just governed by bad people. Yeah. So who steps in? One of our arguments has been that the United States, although we don't want to, do almost anything to avoid it, but the United States needs to be prepared to do that in some cases, simply for our own self-protection. This Roosevelt corollary is making that case very specifically. And again, it's something that those of us who deal with cartel issues, border issues, Latin America issues, need to think about. And however much one might object, I'm certain there would be strong objection in Latin America and Mexico to the phrasing of President Roosevelt on this. The principle remains the same, and I agree with him. I agree with all of this, but I agree on two major points. One is that the U.S. must be prepared to do it, but the other is that it is far preferable, by orders of magnitude, for the Latin American republics to do it for themselves. So it's interesting. I'm so glad you brought that up. I had never heard of this, but now that I have, I think that I want us to talk really quick about Janet Yellen's visit to Mexico. But after that, I will ask you about something that I think ties right into this, and that's what's happening in the small Mexican town of Sasabe. Sure.
I think that's how it's pronounced. I would think.
I think so,
it's just this tiny town surrounded by desert and mountains that's completely ruled by the Sinaloa cartel, and how that's provoking a lot of movement towards Arizona. So I'll ask you about that next.
Okay.
But right now, I think we'll shift gears and talk a little bit about issues we're very familiar with, which is what's happening in Mexico. And I wanted to ask you about Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's visit to Mexico. So the purpose of her visit, I think today is her second date there, but it has been to talk about fentanyl, arms trafficking, and money laundering. And so a couple of things that she's done during her time in Mexico so far is she had a private meeting with President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and we don't really know what was discussed, but apparently it was pretty good, because I'll read you what he posted on social media after it. And then also she signed a memorandum of intent to focus on a national security lens on foreign direct investment.
Yeah.
So, again, although it was a private meeting and we don't know what happened in that conversation, the president said on social media that the good neighbor policy between Mexico and the United States is a tangible reality. Our relationships span various dimensions from friendship to collaborative efforts in economic and financial affairs. As a result, my pleasant meeting with Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, proved to be highly productive. So can I get your thoughts?
Oh, man. I have a lot of thoughts on that. We have to put Yellen's visit into context.
Yeah.
Several different contexts. There has been more and more criticism from within the Biden administration of AMLO this year.
Yeah.
As there has been a realization that AMLO could scuttle re-election for President Biden. I mean that's just the reality. I would love to think that they're stewards of the nation, but let's be candid. Their real interest is in
winning an election.
Will they scuttle re-election by allowing another migrant crisis to which there's a horrific migrant crisis as it is. But to that end, the DEA chief has criticized AMLO. There was an undersecretary at the State Department who criticized AMLO, on public and in public on the record, which is unusual to say the least. What's interesting to me is that the treasury. Two things are interesting about this. One is that Secretary Yellen goes and she arrives at essentially two programmatic agreements. We'll see what the adherence to it is, because an agreement is one thing, but execution is something else. One is some work on fentanyl and precursor chemicals, which is good, and the other is this very interesting foreign review board that apparently the United States and Mexico are going to jointly run to make sure that the Chinese don't economically move into Mexico, which kind of surprised me in full candor. It surprised me for a couple of reasons. One is that AMLO and the Morenistas have been perfectly happy to accept Chinese investment. In fact, I think you and I have been on WhatsApp chains together in which other folks have been talking about how the Chinese basically have a lock on reconstruction in Acapulco.
Yeah.
After the hurricane there, which is exceptionally revelatory. And so the fact that they're publicly agreeing to this working group, which presumably will give the United States a say in curbing foreign direct investment from China in Mexico, that's a big deal. That is Roosevelt corollary action under the Monroe Doctrine, although no party involved would ever say that. But it is the same policy principle that's animating this, which I think illuminates our thesis that that's where you have to go. So the Mexicans are acquiescing to it. Who knows what carrots don't typically work with the Morenistas, but sticks do. And I wonder what the stick was. I just don't know, because as you say, it's a closed-door meeting. That's one thing that's interesting. The other thing that's interesting to me is that the Biden regime is leaning so heavily on the apparatus of the United States Treasury as being at the forefront of its Mexico policy.
Yeah.
It's not DOD, which clearly wants nothing to do with Latin America in general, but it's also not DOJ. Which you would think would be like the stick. It's not, and it's not Department of State either. So
none of the obvious ones.
None of the obvious ones. It's really Treasury. It clearly shows the approach that the White House has decided to take with the Mexicans in terms of the enforcement arm. So the fact that it's the Treasury Secretary who is actually getting these positive outcomes. Let's be charitable. These are good. I'm glad it's happening. Also, you can read a lot into it. One thing I think you definitely can read into it is, frankly, the failure of the Department of State in advancing the American interest. Which you and I have spoken with. we've spoken with a lot of good people in that apparatus. In Mexico, out of Mexico, and so frequently good public servants. But one of the issues with the State Department, wherever you go in the world, is there's a tendency to identify with the subject matter nation. I think I'll put it, and you absolutely see that in the Mexican mission, 100%. So,
no doubt.
So I guess Treasury is now your congratulations, America. Your defense is in the hands of the men and women of the United States Treasury, which
unexpected. But okay.
Well, they may do a good job with this, but these are positive outcomes. But Mexico has. Under AMLO, they've surrendered a measure of sovereignty in favor of the American partnership, which they should in this case. But how interesting.
Yeah. No, how fascinating. But since we're on the topic of Mexico, I will ask you about what I was telling you about a little bit earlier. And that's that I think we saw a picture of this somewhere in one of our many group chats.
Yeah.
But there are two factions right now of the Sinaloa cartel that have been battling over migrant smuggling routes. So they've battled over all sorts of things before, but usually it's like the like drug trafficking routes
Sure.
or control over like local authorities or elections or corrupt security forces. Like there's a million things. But I think this might be the first time that we are seeing them like regularly fighting over migrant smuggling routes. And so earlier this month, we saw also here in this, residents of this small town that I was telling you about, of Sasabe.
Sasabe, yeah.
Which is this, again, this like tiny small outpost right by the U.S.-Mexico border close to Arizona. So their residents have been receiving all sorts of threats and messages just warning of an attack that was going to happen. And so one morning they awoke to a lot of their houses just like engulfed in flames. And then they came outside and there were like dozens of men with high-powered weapons, only in Mexico, right? But it's kind of like a movie or like some sort of episode of a show. But they were shooting each other around the main plaza. So a couple of hours after that, 100 people at least were at the U.S.-Mexico border trying to cross over and save themselves.
So they weren't, just so I understand it, they weren't, the cartels didn't come in and expel the populace of the town. The populace of the town got caught in the crossfire of an intra-cartel battle and
escaped.
Okay.
And they found some sort of hole in the fence and came in and were begging.
Imagine that.
CBP to protect them. And so I found this so interesting because the town has become like some sort of ghost town. And the desperate residents are fleeing, right? And this is something that we were just talking about too with the situation in Guyana.
Mm-hmm.
You know, things that happen there affect migration towards the U.S.
Yeah.
And so on the other side of the border, Arizona broke records for how many people they saw coming in that week. So it's not just Sasabe. There wasn't that many people. It's a very small town. But we're continuing to see like this escalating migration crisis like we've never seen before, right?
Yeah.
They marked, I think 2 weeks ago, they marked the highest weekly total ever in that sector of
in
Arizona.
is it the Tucson sector?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And so I thought that was fascinating. And paired with these new numbers and the situation at the border, which just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, I wanted to ask you about, so they're overwhelmed. Like the Border Patrol, anyone that's working at the border, they're undermanned. They don't have enough resources to deal with it. So what happened to meet these needs is apparently now agents that are along the northern and coastal borders are being asked to help by expediting the virtual processing of illegal immigrants. Have you heard of this?
I think
it's been a little bit on the news.
Yeah.
But virtual processing basically involves like Zoom, basically.
Right.
Like,
It's just, you get on a FaceTime
agents,
call.
Yeah, meeting with migrants over video call. And so I wanted to ask you what you thought about this and if you had seen anything about it.
About all the above. Let me start. Well, so the virtual processing thing is that's the easiest one. I think it's just indicative of the size of the crisis and the inadequacy of the force at hand to meet it. That's really it. If you've got to get on a Zoom call and you're a Border Patrol agent stationed at the the border between Maine and Canada, and you're processing remotely guys that who are coming in the Tucson sector, then that might suggest to me that your bureaucracy is too small, or your political higher ups have allowed the problem to metastasize, which they have.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the limit of my insight on that. The expulsion of the population from Sasabe in Sonora, is that right? It's in Sonora, yeah. That's an interesting one. There's a few things. The flood of migrants coming across illegally entering Arizona. There's anecdotal evidence. I wouldn't place huge credibility on this yet because it seems early to me, but it's possible. There's anecdotal evidence that the passage of SB4 in Texas in the most recent special session has had an effect on migrant flows. Soon it will be possible for Texas law enforcement to arrest you and order your deportation if you have entered Texas illegally across. Removal, right? They have to kind of thread a needle on it. You can order them to return, but they can refuse to do so, in which case they're liable for a felony within Texas.
Arrested.
So it's anyway. Also, again, carrot and stick. There's some anecdotal evidence that even though that has yet to go into effect, I believe, isn't that right? It goes into effect in March, I think.
I think it's it's still on the
I think
governor's
that's right.
desk.
So, yeah,
if
so
I'm not
nobody's
mistaken,
right. Yeah, exactly. But the governor's going to sign it. You know, he said
he will.
Yeah, he said he will, and he will. That the networks are already kind of taking that into effect. So that may be one reason they're coming through Arizona. But what the flight of the population of tiny Sasabe reminds me of is the expulsion of the population of Ciudad Mier it was either 2010 or 2000. It might have been 2011 that this happened. And so Mier is a very old town. It was one of the Nueva Santander settlements. It's a venerable history. It's about 300 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, my great grandmother was born there. She's actually
no
a
way.
native-born citizen of Ciudad. Yes. She's born in 1915. I knew her actually. She passed away in 1994.
Oh, wow.
She made great enchiladas, but that was my favorite with her. She had these wonderful cheese enchiladas. But years later, I found because there's all these digitized records. There's a 1918 Bureau of Labor, believe it or not, Bureau of Labor entry card in which her mother, my great grandmother, brings her into the United States out of Mier. So this is getting a bit off track, but it's interesting. She's brought over as a 3-year-old, and there's actually a declaration that they don't intend to seek citizenship, and so they come over and they join her father, my great grandfather. I think he was Francisco Sainz, if I remember correctly, anyway, the rest is history. And now we're all Texans. So. But Mier, that same city, which has this beautiful historic plaza, a lot of rich history, real strong, cultural presence when you look at the history of the Rio Grande and Nueva Santander and Spanish settlement there. In 2011, I believe, the Zetas came and they emptied out the whole town. They just said, it's time for you to go. We're going to take over the city. We're going to use it as a plaza. And they ended habitation there. People are back now, like a decade plus later.
Yeah.
They returned, but it was kind of a shock.
Yeah.
To me, it was one of the things that alerted me to just the gravity of this crisis, that they could empty out this very historic town. And what ended up happening, as with Sasabe in 2023, is that a lot of the residents of Mier ended up as refugees. They came to Ciudad Miguel Alemán, which is on the river, as refugees in Roma, Texas. And kind of came across, and they sort of they may still be in the United States for all I know. But when that happened, I remembered thinking that this very naive moment that I had as well, now that the cartels are emptying out towns and it's a refugee crisis, I'll bet the federal government's going to do something about it, like the U.S. federal government. I'll bet we're going to wake up to the gravity of the problem. And here we are, 12 years later, and they've hardly woken up at all. But unfortunately, tragedies, a tragedy like Sasabe, you and I notice it, and it comes into our orbit because it's in Mier also because it's hard up on the United States. Yeah. But that's happened over and over and over and over in the Mexican interior, in Sinaloa, in Guerrero, in Michoacán, in Jalisco, in Chiapas, on and on. We probably couldn't count the number of small settlements and towns that have had their civic life ended and their population expelled because a criminal gang has decided it must be so.
Yeah.
The tragedy of Mexico.
And that's so sad for the Mexican people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know as we wrap up this episode, maybe that's one thing we can leave our listeners with, maybe don't take a road trip to Mexico. Well, that's the last thing I wanted to tell you. Well, I think you've heard of this, but I wanted to ask you about the Texan woman that got kidnapped trying to take a road trip through Mexico.
Which
2 weeks ago.
Where was she kidnapped?
In San Fernando. Let me see.
I remember this. Yes. Well,
yeah. So it's a Texas tourist.
Yes.
And cartel gunmen kidnapped her because she was on a cross-country drive trying to go all the way to Belize.
Was she was she Mexican American or just some Anglo lady?
She was from Henderson, Texas.
From Henderson.
Yeah. Just like an Anglo lady. I think she was 47.
Okay.
And she decided that she would drive to Belize, just for tourism purposes.
And she probably just got out Google Maps and mapped the shortest route.
Yeah, and had no idea what's actually happening. But yeah, she was driving in San Fernando. She crossed the border.
San Fernando and Tamaulipas.
Yeah. And she was alone, but a group of 3 gunmen in a 4-door truck pulled alongside her. They told her to stop. They started pointing weapons at her.
Sure.
And what eventually happened is they took her vehicle, they drove her to some sort of local motel. And she was sleeping in some sort of vehicle when she was able to call the police. So she got rescued
So they didn't kidnap her. Or I mean, they did. But they really just stole her vehicle and dropped her off at a hotel. Am I misunderstanding that?
So the men were at a room in the hotel, and they left her in the vehicle for a little bit, I believe, and that's when she was able to use one of the vehicles to call the police. I believe that's what happened.
And the police came and rescued her?
And the police came, I think she called 911, and 911 called the local Mexican authorities, and they came and they rescued her.
Oh,
and
my
now
gosh.
she's fine, but this could have gone a lot of different ways.
Thank God.
And it kind of shows you, the fact that cartels can just pull you over and kidnap you and have no fear, this is what's happening in Mexico.
You have to. You have to know where you're going. And you and I know this. When we go to Mexico City for work, for example, this places that we don't go. And you have to. If you don't know what you're doing, you have to have somebody who does and who can give you appropriate cautions. And then the risk assessment is always conditional, right? You just don't know. That being said, driving to San Fernando is completely insane. I remember as early as 2016, I believe, I was having conversations about San Fernando in a completely different context with somebody who was contemplating going there, and so we asked some folks in Mexico about it, and the intel we got back is that San Fernando is a cartel town. Apparently, so this is secondhand. I'm not going to go verify this, but apparently San Fernando is one of the towns where they've the cartel controlling it, which I think was at the time. This is, again, 7 years ago. Cartel del Golfo, I believe.
Okay.
But they'd wired up the whole town with with closed circuit television, and so they just monitor who comes in and out. And if they don't recognize you, it's not a big town, but if they don't recognize you, they're going to come get you, and they'll probably kill you. So this woman is extremely lucky to be alive. She's also extremely lucky that when she called for help, that there was that there were police willing to help, because typically the police are honestly, what that tells me? That tells me that the men who kidnapped her and took her vehicle were probably freelancing. Because if they had been real organization men, there is no way the San Fernando cops were going to come and rescue her. She would have been a complete goner. We've got friends in Mexico. I'll be non-specific here, but who had close friends of theirs kidnapped in this very beautiful recently national park.
I think it was on Thanksgiving, right?
I believe so. Yeah. And so in a place in Candor where they wouldn't have expected to, but this very beautiful national park and the center of Mexico, and gunmen come out of the tree line and kidnap these young women, and again, thank God, in their particular case, law enforcement found them. They were rescued, but what an absolute nightmare, knowing that this could happen anywhere. And so again, I think that's probably the right note to close on. The primary victims of all this, whether it's in South America or Central America or up in Mexico, are the people themselves who were there. And we can only, in our work at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, in Texas policy and U.S. policy, obviously our orientation is toward the welfare of Texans and Americans first. But we can't forget that the almost as a byproduct, but a happy one, the principal beneficiaries of our work are going to be them. Who can live in some kind of peace and prosperity. Anyway,
that's a positive way to end a very depressing conversation.
Yes,
but thank you, Josh.
Happy birthday to the Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah,
yes.
and Merry Christmas. I think this is our last episode before the holidays, so we'll be...
I think it is. And for our Mexican viewers, Buen Fiesta de la Virgen de Guadalupe on December 12th.
Yeah.
Yes. So sadly, I won't make the pilgrimage this year, but having done it 5 times, it's always restorative to the soul. So
maybe next year. Yeah.
Melissa, good talking.
Well, thank you, Josh, and thank you to all of our listeners. We'll see you next year.